Chapter 1. Dan was at a loss. He had no words. His mind drew a blank when Damianos' contrite face seemed to age with every second that passed.
"Again, I am sorry, Dan. I had no way of knowing of Daniel's intentions."
"Why weren't you with my family when my son left the boat?" Dan demanded. The four men were sitting in the lounge of Solangi's old house. Dan had just completed the reading of his book, which had given him all the tools he needed to embark on a journey that was supposed to lead him through an alternate future. It had been his dream since childhood to fly an aircraft. He wanted to be a pilot above all. Apparently God himself had granted him the opportunity to retrace his steps from the day he landed in the clearing of a park in Key West to his ultimate destination, his home and family in Davie, Florida. However, now he couldn't fathom how he would dare take the first step toward accomplishing his goal while knowing his son was presumably lost in time.
"I was watching over your family, Dan, until I was alerted that you and Gustavo were ready to start your journey in Chippewa's company. A few minutes are all that it took for Daniel to jump overboard, literally, and go for a swim."
"And you didn't wait for him to come back?" Dan was obviously incensed.
"We are all waiting for him to come back now, yes. But if Daniel has decided to venture farther offshore than he should have done, he might have returned to the pier at a time when we were someplace else."
"I don't understand," Dan said, shaking his head. "Even if he returned to the past when we were presumably with you someplace else, how could he find himself alone on the pier at the same moment? It doesn't make any sense." "Questioning everyone's moments before Daniel's escapade," Chippewa put in, "is not going to be helpful." Gustavo, Dan, and Damianos turned their attention to the Dreammaker. He was sitting upright in the high-backed chair. "Yes, you see, your son taking a swim is what we need to focus on. He presumably swam out of bounds, as it were, and returned to the pier at the time the cruiser had left the marina without him. Can you recall when that would be?" he asked Damianos.
The latter shook his head. "I could only be sure of one thing. Daniel was with his mother and siblings all the time, except when he accompanied you, Gustavo, to Iran. Every time we left the boat, we were together, or I knew where your family was, Dan. The time I came to help you remember your past, your family was on a deserted island, travelling through a jungle to get to the clearing near my house."
"Yes, I remember you saying something like that. But now it's not a matter of finding out where my family is located, it's a matter of finding my son," Dan concluded, obviously dumbfounded. "What is it that you remember reading in your book, Dan?" Chippewa asked. "What has that got to do with anything?" Dan demanded, glaring at Chippewa. "Nothing of what that book told me is going to help me find my son." "That's where you're wrong, Dan," Chippewa countered. "Everything you've learned or recalled through reading your book will help all of us locate your son." Dan shook his head vigorously. "Don't you think all of you have done enough? Not only couldn't I rejoin my family when they were right beside me at the racetrack, but you prevented me to meet them when they arrived in Key West. And now you want to take me again on some other trip where you're going to find my son? Why would I even listen to what you're saying? You've led me astray. You've proposed this alternate future to me, and yes, I made the choice to pursue my dream, but if accomplishing that dream is at the cost of my son's life, forget it. I'm not going anywhere with any of you." Gustavo turned to his friend. He was dismayed. He never wanted for any of this to happen, of course, but he surely didn't want to see Dan walk away from their friendship either. "What do you say? We get out of here and go for a walk," he suggested. "Yeah, might as well," Dan agreed, getting to his feet. He looked at Damianos. "You'd better find an answer, you darn cat. If not, I don't think even God will forgive you for this one." As soon as Gustavo and Dan stepped outside the front door of the old mansion, neither man could believe their eyes. The hillside was covered of new snow and surrounded by hedges of fir trees. 3 kids were tobogganing down the hill, laughing and enjoying their time outdoors. "What on earth is this?" Dan asked, not recognizing where he and Gustavo were. "Are these my children, do you think?" He turned to his friend. "I suppose so," Gustavo replied, hugging himself against the cold wind. "But why are we here? That's what I'd like to know."
"No need to wonder," Damianos said, appearing in front of the 2 men. "This is only an image of the memories you keep in the recesses of your mind, Dan."
"What are you doing here?" Dan shouted. "I told you I don't want to go anywhere with you." Damianos snapped his fingers and the image disappeared. They were again standing on the porch of the house. The snow had yielded to a mantle of green grass bathing in the July sunshine.
"And I will leave Chippewa to show you the path to your future. He will retrace the steps you had once taken, and that until you reach your present in 2013.
"What about finding my son? Are you considering yourself off the hook and relieved of your duties?" Dan was more than irritated by this time. "I told you, you better find an answer to where Daniel was gone, and the date at which I could find him. Otherwise, I'll take my chances by myself, and maybe with Gustavo's help we can figure this out. Dan switched his gaze to his friend. He was pleading. They heard the front door open.
Why don't you come back inside, Dan? I think there are 2 people waiting to talk to you in the living room.
Who are they? Dan asked. I really don't think we've got time for a chit-chat. Damien pushed the door open to let Solangi go ahead of him. Oh, our guardian angels are here too, Dan said mockingly. Won't that be fun? Everybody is here instead of finding out where my son is, he chortled derisively. And what have you got to say for yourselves? Have you come to commiserate with me on my loss? Enough, Damien shouted commandingly. Your anger, Dan, although well justified, has no place in your mind if you wish to accomplish any task. Oh, why don't you get off my back? You've not guarded over my son's life, and now you want me to listen to your scolding? Just go and find Daniel, and then we'll talk. If that's the way you feel, Dan, that's fine with us, Damien retorted, nodding to Solangi. We'll be on our way. And with these words, the 2 angels vanished. Now what? Chippewa demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. Still dressed in his cowboy boots, jeans, and plaid shirt, the little guy pinched his lips until they disappeared in between his moustache and beard. Now Gustavo and I are going for a walk and have a talk, if that's okay with you. Fine with me. When you 2 are tired of making plans, I'll be waiting for you inside, Chippewa replied, uncrossing his arms and flinging the front door open and marching inside the house. Now that you've sent everybody away, Gustavo said as both men were on their way toward the forest that bordered the old house, what do you intend to do? I didn't send anybody away, Dan snapped back. I just told them how I felt. I don't want any more teaching, any more reading. I just want to find my son. If that's all you want, why don't you want to listen to what these people have to say? They might have some clue as to where your son is. No, they don't, Gustavo. They have all of us in one place at one time, and they separated us. And I'm not going to forget that, believe me. Dan paused as the 2 of them reached the edge of the forest. Besides, Damienos was supposed to tell my family what would happen if they went off on their own, but he didn't, and now he's got no idea where my son could be. They walked in silence for a few minutes until the forest seemed to close upon them. The trail, which had been quite visible up to that point, had surrendered to the underbrush that now covered it. Let's go back to the house, Gustavo suggested anxiously. Maybe Chippewa can shift gear and find out a way to accomplish your dream. And what dream would that be? Dan demanded, peering into Gustavo's gaze. The one where you're reunited with your family, with your son. Dan stared. He had lost all perspective on the problem. His anger against the very people who could help him had overshadowed the reason for his frustration. Okay, you're right. Maybe the little guy can show us a way out of this mire. As they turned around to retrace their steps along the trail, they looked down to find it, but it wasn't there to be found. Maybe we should have left some breadcrumbs behind us, Gustavo said, cracking a smile. It looks like we're lost. No, Gustavo, we're not lost, Dan retorted. It's one of Damienos' tricks, I'm sure. Why would he start playing tricks when he needs to be working on finding your son? Because he's a cat, Gustavo. He loves to play, and however old he is, that trait of character of his will not abandon him under any circumstances. What do you propose we do now? Gustavo asked, upturning his gaze to the tree's umbrella. It's not like we can see the sun from here, is it? Let's try and fray a passage through these bushes, Dan suggested as he started shoving branches and foliage out of his way. Suddenly, not 3 feet ahead of them, a clearing appeared from behind the trees. What did I tell you? Dan said, stopping in his tracks. Damienos is at it again. Gustavo stared ahead of him. This is the meadow in front of his house. I bet we'll find him waiting for us as we step out of the forest. But why? Gustavo asked again. Isn't it a big waste of time? I don't think so. I don't think so, Damienos replied from a distance. As Dan had expected, the old shepherd was standing in front of his little house. Why wouldn't it be, Damienos? Dan inquired as the 2 men walked toward him. Because, Dan, the first thing one should do when trying to find something or someone is going back to the place where one lost the object of one's search. In occurrence, your son. But the clearing is not where you lost sight of my son. You should be aboard the cruiser, not standing here with us. I appreciate your confusion, but in fact you're the one who's lost a son, not me. If your comments are designed to appease my anger, Damienos, you're not succeeded. You've not succeeded, but just to show you that I can listen as well as the next man, do go ahead and tell us what we're doing here. This is where it all started, Dan. You landed in a clearing very similar to this one in Key West, and at that moment you lost your family, including your son. So I suggest you go back to the last time you saw your son, and I believe that was during the bike race, wasn't it? Okay, I'll bite,
Dan replied, knowing that turning on his heels and ignoring Damianos' comments would not play in his favour. Very good. At that point, and when you returned to the apartment in Key West, you knew your son, your whole family actually, had reached their destination, and you were about to be reunited with them, didn't you? Yes, and if it weren't for you saying that I wasn't ready to meet them, I would have been standing with them in my future right now, instead of being searching for Daniel.
No time for recrimination, Dan.
What we need to find out now is where Daniel could have gone from that date. Why from that date? Gustavo asked. Because as Dan could tell you, you can't relive your future unless you've visited your past first. You've lost me, Dan said, a scowl appearing across his brow. Daniel and his mother and siblings wouldn't have been able to live that race unless they had visited the past and relived a past event. You can't relive your future since you never lived it in the first place. Gustavo shook his head. So I could go back to driving a truck in Iran, but I couldn't go forward and drive my semi in Atlanta. Is that what you're saying? Exactly, Gustavo. So Daniel has lived through that race with you, Dan, and now he has gone down to a time and place in his past, but not anywhere in his future. Okay, Dan said. But why don't we focus on the last place he was seen and take it from there? That's what I was going to suggest next. The interval of time he could have gone is not that great either. You see, the interval between the time of the bike race and the time he first took a swim on his own is probably where we will find him. He couldn't have gone anywhere before his birth unless I was with him, or after the race since he hadn't lived through the future beyond that.